The following recording is a program of the World War I Historical Association. This special ongoing series commemorates the centennial of the First World War.
This is Dana Lombardi. On September 20th, 2014, the Florida and Gulf Coast chapter of the World War I Historical Association held a seminar with the co-sponsorship of the Public Library of Foley, Alabama. 6 noted scholars gave presentations under the theme 1914 Europe Goes to War. These presentations are presented here in 6 videos recorded at the event.
A distinguished career as an infantryman, as well as being head of the history department at West Point, one of our most prestigious educational institutions. The last speaker alluded to the Ardennes battle breakthrough at Sedan during World War II, 1940. One of Bob's older books is about that. It's called Breakthrough, and it's just been reissued. In fact, I wrote a copy of it. But he's best known for his work on, of course, on the French Army. That's his real specialty. And, of course, on World War I. His bio is on the back of the program sheet, including an award there for Pyrrhic Victory, our book award for every year here. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I got one.
Let me begin by saying it's a pleasure being here today. My wife and I own a condo down in Orange Beach. We come to Orange Beach about once a month for a week. We always drive through Foley, and we're always pleased when we drive through Foley with all of the greenery, with all of the flowers. It really is a nice town to drive to. I want to compliment you, those of you who may in fact be from Foley. My goal today is really to talk about Marshal Joffre. His name was Joseph Jacques Césaire Joffre. He said to one of his friends one time, or he was asked what his friends called him, and he said, "My friends call me Joseph. Some of the ladies call me Césaire." So he's a man that is very, very different from what we often see, particularly in English language books. The traditional view that is often repeated is the one that Liddell Hart had. Liddell Hart said, "His slow wits combined with his inexperience of higher war studies made him a modern Delphic oracle, the mere mouthpiece of a military priesthood, among whom de Grandmaison was the leading intellectual influence and de Castelnau the acting high priest. His ignorance of European warfare had been officially recognized by the nomination of General de Castelnau as his assistant." Most English language sources that you pick up, I'm thinking Corelli Barnett, as well as many others, they will invariably go back to Joffre the fool, Joffre the man who thinks through his stomach, Jacques Joffre, who was a leader more by accident than anything else. Well, he is an interesting character. This painting shows him at the end of the time when he was chief of the general staff. The French would say chef d'état-major. Here his hair is gray. He's portly the way he was, particularly in the latter phase of his command. But when he took over in 1911, he had blonde hair, blonde mustache, and what happened in 1911, 1912 is this blonde hair turned gray, like mine is about to turn gray. But he really was an interesting character. It's often said that his family was a cooper. In fact, his father was a cooper early in his life. Then he became he bought some vineyards. He became fairly successful owner of that vineyards. So Joffre, in fact, came from a fairly well-to-do family. Not a wealthy family, and certainly not part of upper French society, but from a fairly prosperous family. He was born down in southern France, right on the edge of the Mediterranean, near where the Spanish border meets the Mediterranean in France. His parents were born there. Both sets of grandparents were born there, and then all sets of grandparents above that were born there. His family had some military experience. He had a relative who had fought with Napoleon. Practically everyone in France at this time had someone who had fought with Napoleon. He had an uncle who also was a graduate of the École Polytechnique. So there was some military background in his family. But he goes to the École Polytechnique in 1869. Franco-Russian War, 1870-1871, the French Commune. He really becomes part of an artillery unit, ends up being in Paris during a part of the Commune, when the Germans, the Prussians had besieged Paris. The Communards asked him to help with the defense of Paris. He did something, but then he in fact went home to the Pyrenees area when Paris surrendered, and he really did not take part in any of the Communard activities at all. But he will come back to Paris after the Commune, after the peace. He will go back to the École Polytechnique. When he first entered the École Polytechnique, they gave them ranks according to the scores that they had coming in, and he was ranked in what I would call the second quarter. He was not in the top quarter. He was in the second quarter. He didn't spend much time at the École Polytechnique before, in fact, he's commissioned, and then he goes out into the army. He ranks high enough in his class to be an engineer, and he will spend the first part of his career as an engineer. This is the golden age of building of the forts on the northeastern frontier, the Serre de Rivière fortifications. He takes part in that. There are fortifications built along the Pyrenees. He takes part in that. And he has a solid reputation as an engineer, or as I often say, an engineer. He will then ask for overduty assignment, and he will go to wait, I lost track here. He will go to Formosa, and in Formosa he will be in charge of building the fortifications of Formosa. This is the time when a treaty is signed between the Chinese and the French. The French will give up that area of Formosa. They will move into Hanoi or Vietnam. He will go to Hanoi. He will be an engineer in Hanoi, and he will actually be involved in some combat operations in Vietnam. At one point, he is the chief engineer when they besieged some of the Vietnamese rebels. If you know where the line between North Vietnam and South Vietnam used to be, it was just north of that line. There was a revolutionary camp there. The French and some of the Vietnamese loyal forces besieged that camp. Basically what Joffre did was Vauban classic besieging, in the sense of digging the trenches, draining the swamp. At the end, they will in fact set some of the fortifications for the revolutionaries on fire. They will assault, they will be repulsed. They do more digging, more working, and eventually they will be successful. So he has a very successful background as a combat engineer. Then he will go to Paris. He's he's been in the army now about 16, 17 years. He's going to serve in the office of the Chief of Engineers, which overlooks all of the engineering activities of the French army. And then he will be assigned to the 5th Engineer Regiment at Versailles, where he will work on railway logistics. Now, this is the classic period in terms of the development of railways in France. When they first built railways, all the lines went to Paris, just like spokes out of a wheel. And then in 1888, 1892, The Minister of War, de Freycinet, will come up with a Freycinet plan, or they will connect those spokes. So if you go out to Strasbourg and you want to go to Lille, you in fact now can go cross country, as opposed to originally going from Strasbourg to Paris back to Lille. My point is, he's one of the first people to get involved with the railway logistics. He is a guy who understands logistics, and most of all, he is an engineer officer who understands railways. Now, he will go from this position to Africa. He will be assigned down there to Africa to build a railway that links Senegal and the Niger rivers. He will get there. There is a French Marine Lieutenant Colonel who puts together this grand scheme that they're going to go to Timbuktu. He gets wrapped up in the middle of this. He's in charge of the land drive to Timbuktu, while the Marine Lieutenant Colonel is going to go down the river and somehow find his way to Timbuktu. That whole column is ambushed and is destroyed. Joffre, going cross country with his column, gets to Timbuktu. When he gets to Timbuktu, he seizes Timbuktu, and there he finds a message telling the Marine Lieutenant Colonel, don't go to Timbuktu. In fact, leave Timbuktu alone. And Joffre will communicate with Paris, and they will send back a message, get out of Timbuktu, go back to where you were. Well, he decides to stay. He ignores the orders, and ultimately the Parisian government will reverse itself, and Joffre comes out of this a hero. He is the conqueror of Timbuktu, and it adds considerably to his reputation. So now he's returned to Paris. This is 1894, and he's returning as a hero. He arrives in the middle of what's known as the Affaire des Fiches, which is where the Minister of War, André, was keeping cards on all the officers in terms of whether or not they went to church regularly, whether they were religious, whether they were Masons. In essence, it was those of the left dominating the political process, trying to infuse more Republican ideas into the army. Joffre comes out well in this. He is recognized for his capability. He does not go to church. He joins a Freemason society. And he gets interested in a woman. When he first graduated from the École Polytechnique, he tried to marry a woman who was the sister of one of his classmates. She was a widow. She had 2 children. She was 6 years older than him. He tried to marry her. The army said, no, you can't marry her. He went back again several times with requests to marry her, and eventually he got approval to marry her. Well, they were married. They were married for a very short period, and then she died of rubella. Well, when he comes back to Paris in 1894, he finds another woman that he likes, Henriette Pinon. The problem with this was that she was married to someone else, and she refused to get a divorce from her husband. They were seen together frequently in January 1997, and roughly 9 months thereafter, she had a daughter. What Joffre later said about this was about the daughter, and he said, she's a Plaz. Now his mother's maiden name was Plaz, and he thought this child looked like his mother. He never admitted that he was the father, but he did say she looks like a Plaz from his mother's family. The woman, however, refused to marry him. She stayed married to her husband. Now, Joffre gets on orders to go to Madagascar. Here he works for the great General Joseph Gallieni. He's in charge of the fortifications in Madagascar, and Gallieni is very impressed. Not like he's impressed in 1914, but he's impressed with the capabilities of Joffre. Joffre is then sent back to Paris as an engineer to get more money for the engineering works in Madagascar. And he ends up being fairly successful with this. He walks through all the buildings there with this, and he ends up getting a promotion out of it. He ends up getting moved back to Paris against Gallieni's objections and added to the staff there. He becomes a General de Division, from a General de Brigade, Brigadier General to a Major General. And he does become more politically active in the sense of his colleagues call him the crab. And by that they mean he's thick, he's got a heavy girt, but he never walks to the right. He always walks to the left. So they were aware of his political interests, his political leanings. But he does, once he gets promoted to General de Division, he does marry Henriette. Henriette gets a divorce from her husband. They're married in a civil ceremony. He was married in a civil ceremony to his first wife, the one who died of rubella, and she becomes a major part of his life. If you go through the correspondence from Joffre during World War I, almost every night he will write his wife a letter, a passionate love letter, not, I had a good breakfast today, went out to see the troops. Just one passionate love letter after another. Not the sort of thing that you really would expect from someone like General Joffre. But he's now on the fast track. Once he gets married, and I don't know if that was the key, I'm not sure what the key is, he commands an infantry division. Where does he command an infantry division? As an engineer? In Paris. If you go today to Paris on the Boulevard Haussmann and come to the Cercle Militaire, it's a big huge building that's still an officers' club today, and you look at the front of it, there's a plaque that says General Joffre commanded a division here during these years. Now, it is no accident that Joffre commands a division in Paris. I mean, this is not where people learn about infantry tactics. This is where people practice politics. And he is very, very good at this. He will go from being a division commander to being a corps commander. He commands a corps in Amiens, which is not far from Paris. So his connections with Paris do not disappear. His participation in getting to know the politicians does not get degraded at all. He will get another promotion and responsibility in that he will be named Chief of Rear Services for the French Army. He becomes a member of the Conseil Supérieur de la Guerre, the Superior War Council. And he will be in charge of logistics, manufacturing, transportation, all of those things that will be so key to the French in World War I. But this is the natural sequence of positions for him in the sense of his engineering background, building fortifications, his having worked with railways. I didn't mention the fact that he had commanded an artillery brigade at one point. He's not an infantry guy. He's an engineer who knows his logistics, who knows his transportation, who knows how to get from point A to point B with people and with all the equipment that are required. Now, when he becomes chief of the General Staff, he is picked in 1911 by André Massimi. Massimi is one of the oddest characters in French military history as far as I'm concerned. He is a loose cannon. He's more like Donald Rumsfeld than just about anybody you could find. He would be willing to make a decision on the spot without knowing anything about it. And he chose Joffre. He chose Joffre over other French generals who had a lot of line experience, who had gotten their ticket punched at all the right places. Once the war starts, one of the severest critics of General Joffre is André Massimi. Massimi hates him, and writes constant letters to everyone he knows in Paris about the failures of Joseph Joffre. We've seen once the war starts, he will in fact become it starts out as battalion commander, regimental commander, brigade commander, ends up being a division commander in the war itself. But while Joffre is the chief of the general staff, the French army undergoes a transformation. We usually associate this with Louis Loiseau de Grandmaison, and his last name really is Loiseau de Grandmaison, not Grandmaison, because of the offensive outrance, because of the emphasis on the offense at any cost, and all the terrible costs that the French will pay for this in 1914. But he will do other things. A gentleman was talking about German maneuvers. The French did maneuvers every year also. Joffre will hold maneuvers in the years that he's the chief of the general staff. And what they will do to add to these is they will test weapon systems during these autumn maneuvers. Meaning, they test new artillery, they test aircraft. They try to not only look at the capability of one army opposing another, but trying to integrate some of the modern technology to include communications. And Joffre was very important with this. He'll fight for more training areas for the French army because he realizes that modern units are much larger than those during the Franco-Prussian War, and to train them, you need much more maneuver space. He will become involved in the huge debate over 3-year service. He wants 3-year service. The French army had 2-year service up to about 12 and 13. When the Germans increased the size of their army in 12-13, the French will add a 3rd year of service to their conscripts. Their conscripts would serve for 3 years in the active army, 10 years in the reserve, 6 years in what would be called the territorial army, and then another 6 years in the reserves of the territorial army. But it was incredibly controversial to add that 3rd year of service. Joffre said the French army needs this because the German army can mobilize more quickly. They can put troops in France faster than we can mobilize. We have to have a larger standing army in order to be able to confront that. He also said we need the experience of those 3rd year conscripts. They will be our young leaders, our young tactical leaders, and we need that leadership at the tactical level. Even though it was a hot button issue in French politics, they were able to pass it. Many historians today, when they look at France in this period, will emphasize the idea of the Réveil national, the national revival, or sort of the revanche, desire for a revenge. But there are some practical motivations in the sense of the size of the army versus the size of the German army, and then the need for experience at the lower tactical level. The other thing that he will do, and he will put considerable capital into this, is to work on the Russians to make sure the Russians attack Germany the same time that the French attack. You know about the Franco-Russian alliance of 1892. Once that alliance comes into place, I mean, there are a lot of moving parts on this in the sense of, okay, when you say attack simultaneously, what do you mean simultaneously? How many days after mobilization will the attacks occur? Shouldn't they occur at about the same dates in order to have the maximum effect? And the next is, where should these attacks occur? Where should these offensives be? From the French perspective, looking at the Russians, they didn't want the Russians attacking into Austria. They wanted them attacking into East Prussia. They wanted them putting pressure on Germany, so in fact the Germans will be forced to keep some corps against the Russians, and will take that capability, that combat capability, from the French frontier to the German frontier. And he in fact will spend the month, he'll meet with the Russian Chief of the General Staff on 2 or 3 different occasions before the war, where they go down through the Franco-Russian lines and say, Franco-Russian line says that we're defensive, but we agree that even though it says we're defensive, we can conduct offensive operations. They will agree on the number of troops that will be mobilized on a certain day. They go over the details of what their operations will be and what their goals will be. But he spends a huge amount of capital on it. His trip to Russia in August 1913 is very interesting, because they get on a train and they drive across Germany, to include Berlin, to get to Russia. The Germans will let them through only if they block out all of the windows on the train. And not sure what they could have seen off a train, but they may have seen something. And they ride to St. Petersburg, and then 3 weeks later they ride back. But Joffre's main concern with the Russians is, you got to attack simultaneously with the French. If you delay, that means the Germans can concentrate all of their army against us. If we're going to emerge victorious, you have to make some sort of contribution to divert these resources, these people, from the French front. So that's very, very important. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about Joffre is his command style. If you again, you look at Little Hart and some of the others, the British are not impressed with Joffre. They don't like Joffre, to say the least. But if you think about it, he does fairly well in the Marne campaign in 1914. He battered Moltke is back, 100 miles from the front line, communicating via Marconi telegraph with runners and all of that, whereas Joffre, in fact, is moving around. Now, Joffre absolutely abhorred the telephone. He did not like to get calls on the telephone. Whatever came to him, he wanted it in writing. He wanted to read it. He wanted to think about it, and then he wanted to approve it. But in the Marne campaign, he in fact gets out of his headquarters, moves his headquarters a bit, and then will actually meet with commanders. In some cases, relieve them when he meets them. But he will meet with commanders, and there is a personal dimension to that. The most famous meeting is when Joffre meets Sir John French, asking that he will come back into the battle when Sir John had taken the BEF out of the battle. He's trying to get them back into the battle, up around Paris to fill in it. And at one point he'll bang his hand on the desk and say, Marshal, the honor of England is at stake. So there is a personal dimension here. But he very much insulates himself from some of the goings-on in terms of the personal classes. When he puts his headquarters together, initially he only has 80 officers in his headquarters. By the end of his command, December 1916, there are about 300 officers in that headquarters. They will end up at Chantilly, which is north of Paris, the Hotel du Condé. First floor is administrators, operators. Second floor is Joffre's office. I'll mention more on this in a second. Joffre's office, the office of the Chief of Staff. In fact, he did follow it very, very closely. Now, how did he follow it? The other great misinterpretation from my perspective is that the Young Turks controlled him, that the Young Turks, the young officers had total control over him. In my view, it's precisely the opposite. What would happen is that a young officer would be those of you who've been wore a uniform. You're the action officer. You got an issue. You get a paper. You get the signatures. You've got the options. You got the recommendations. You go in to get somebody to get them to sign it, and they would go in and brief Joffre. And the rules were they could brief, they could give their points, they could make whatever argument they wanted, and then they shut up. And Joffre would ask questions. He would contemplate it for a while. He would close his eyes and sort of lean in his chair, roll around, and then he might make a decision, or he might put off making a decision. If the action officer had the bad judgment to sort of interrupt this process with more extraneous information, Joffre would lose his cool, start yelling and screaming, you know, obviously the action officers would learn pretty quickly how to work with Joffre. But if you go through the correspondence of the Grand Quartier Général on all of the key papers, you will find his little blue initials. He's gone through every single one of those. He's put his initials on every single one of them, and in many cases he has made changes, and you can see the different graphs in terms of how they went in. So the Young Turks, no doubt, are influential and are important. Joffre will pick a young officer, Pelé, P-E-L-L-A, who could speak German fluently, who'd been a military attaché in Germany. He had graduated at the top of his class from the École Polytechnique, and he was his chief of staff. And he was smart, and he knew how to work with Joffre. But it was Joffre that made those decisions, not Pelé. Pelé knew his place, and all the other officers on that staff knew their place. He also traveled around. When he traveled, three vehicles went with him. He got his vehicle, which was some sort of modified. You know, it's not a horse and buggy thing. It's a vehicle with four wheels and an engine. But they made an office in the back part of this. Probably looks like an old T-model Ford, where he had places where he could file papers. He had a driver, and it was sort of somewhere where he could get into, be insulated, and go to wherever he was going on that particular day. He often visited units. When he visited them, he always ate in the field. He ate some of the finest meals in France as he traveled around to these different units. He had an aide by the name of Touzelier, and he would often say, "Oh, poor Touzelier, he's got to do all of this arrangements." Well, Touzelier was sort of the best Batman that's been around. He knew how to take care of General Joffre. But Joffre would come back to his headquarters at night. He would do whatever meetings he was going to have, and he would eat. Usually he ate alone, or he would eat with one or two different people who were specifically invited for that meal. If you think about how Joffre did this, in many ways he insulated himself from some of the enormous pressure that he would feel, that Sir Douglas Haig would feel, that Falkenhayn would feel, or any of them, by carefully controlling his schedule, carefully controlling who could talk to him, how they talked to him, what the format the talking came to him in. It enabled him to survive all the pressure, all the ups and downs. Now, he was not an impressive-looking man when he went out to visit troops. He was kind of overweight, and he was kind of frumpy, and his uniforms were not always the spiffiest around. And he would often participate in ceremonies, pinning young soldiers with medals, or generals with medals. But he did not go forward to the trenches. He would occasionally make a foray into the trenches, but he was not one like Charles Mongin, who would go on the front lines, and then there are soldiers with him to play chicken, stick up their heads and see who would be the first person to drop their head below the trench. He did none of that. He never participated in anything like that. But on one of these trips, he was visiting a unit, and he went to an ambulance where a young soldier just came in who had just, it was an artillery blast or a mine or something like this, and the young soldier had lost both eyes. Both eyes were blown out, and he was still bleeding, and they brought him into the aid station, and Joffre pinned the medal on him, and as he pinned the medal on him, the soldier started crying. And it really, you know, Joffre came through with the thing, but when he got back to his limousine, he told Touzillier and the others, don't ever do that to me again. If you make me do things like that, I'll never be able to order another attack. So he did insulate himself from the personal dimension of this and the personal feelings of this. Now, he really lacked the charisma of people like Philippe Pétain, Charles Maugin, even Robert Nivelle. But what he had was composure. What he had was composure. And in the sense that you see Moltke break down in the campaign of the Marne. You don't see Joffre break down. When you get to the Battle of Verdun, ultimately it's Falkenhayn who will break down. It is not Joffre. I don't know how he maintained his composure, but he did. I'm sure part of the reason was, or part of the explanation of how he did it, goes back to his insulating himself from some pressures, his controlling his schedule, and controlling what he did. He also performed extraordinarily well at conferences. You wouldn't think he was a great public speaker, but a person no less than David Lloyd George, read Lloyd George's memoirs, will comment on how effective Joffre was at the Allied conferences, intervening, speaking. Lloyd George called him one of the most effective people participating in conferences like that he has ever seen. The most remarkable thing about Joffre, though, is that he lasted as long as he lasted. It's amazing that the French did not fire him after the debacle of 1914. It's amazing that they didn't fire him after the failures in the spring offensives in 1915 or the huge offenses in Champagne in 1915, or after right in the middle of Verdun. In each case, they in fact talked about it, they argued about it, but somehow or another Joffre maintained his position. If you stand back for a second and look at Joffre, he compares favorably to someone like Sir John French, in my mind, compares even more favorably to Sir Douglas Haig. He compares favorably to Moltke. He compares favorably to Falkenhayn. When you get to Hindenburg, Ludendorff, no, those two are maybe in a class of their own. He certainly is in a different league than Conrad Conrad von Herzendorf in Austria. But he is a remarkable man. He made some huge mistakes. He is responsible for those thousands of deaths that occurred in those fruitless offensives in 1914, and even more, he bears responsibility for those horrible losses of 1915, where they will attack without artillery, without wire cutters, without the sort of things that they would know later that they absolutely need. But every night he would write his wife a passionate love letter. Once he was relieved, he will come back to Paris. He will provide advice to the government. He will have an office in the École de Guerre where he'll have a limited amount of administrative support. You know, after the facade of his actually being in charge of French forces is removed, and he really is kicked off the throne. And he will offer advice. He'll play an important role. We can talk about later with the Americans, his influence over the Americans. And at the end of the war, he will march down the Champs-Élysées with Foch at the head of the column when the French celebrate the victory on July 14th, 1919. But he still remains a free thinker. He still doesn't go to church. He finally will marry his second wife in the church. She will convince him to do that. And then when he's on his deathbed, he will be administered last rites in the Catholic faith. So he's an interesting, really an interesting man. He's not the sort of single-dimensional man that is so often portrayed, that he's portrayed as in many of the English language materials. A very complicated man, a very talented man, an engineer down to his toes, one who thinks logically, adds up columns and comes up with answers and follows what comes out of that column. But he remains a controversial man. I assure you, the next book that comes out about World War I, when they talk, if it's published in London in particular, and they deal with Joffre, the adverbs, the adjectives will not be positive as they treat him. But that's Joffre the man. He's a complicated man. He's an interesting man. He's not the one-dimensional man that we often see him portrayed as being.
What do you think of the opinion that he's the man who saved France in 1914?
He gets the credit in my mind, and not Gallieni for that, because remember he's a railroad man, and he has started moving troops to the left flank. He's the one who understood how to move troops to the left flank. When he was head of the when he first came on as director of rear services in 1911, he ran what he called two maneuvers, and that maneuver was to take troops from the northeastern France and move them to northwestern France. That was a concept that he not only knew, that he had worked on. The debate between the Gallieni supporters and the Joffre supporters has to do with Gallieni encouraging Joffre to make his attack a day early. One day earlier than what Joffre had scheduled that to be. In my mind, they couldn't even have talked about that had Joffre not already moved the troops in place, prepared for trying to turn the German flank. He really is the victor of the Battle of Marne. That's his high point. That victory will enable him to keep critics away, keep the knives away from his throat, in the sense of people wanting to get rid of him for the next two years. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Comparing Foch and Joffre.
Yeah.
Which ones? I know it's different times and different. Both good, both bad, both the same.
Foch is a very complicated individual, just as Joffre. Initially, Joffre is the one who brings Foch into the higher circle, in the sense of the 1914 campaign, putting him in charge of that army that's going to hold the right flank. Foch is Joffre's confidant, in the sense that they will meet and they will discuss ideas, they will discuss different alternatives. Foch, in fact, was an intellectual. Joffre was an engineer. The interesting thing is Pershing's view of Joffre and Foch. Pershing detested Foch, and said he's a professor of history and strategy. He's no commander. The one I like is Joffre. He really liked Joffre. He thought Joffre was more of a commander, had better ideas, was realistic. He thought Foch dealt in theory, whereas Joffre dealt in reality. If I had to compare the two, I would say both did well when they faced the challenges that they faced. I don't know anyone else in 1918 who could have pulled the Allies together better than Foch. That's a remarkable accomplishment, and maybe ultimately that gives Foch the best grade, because he gained victory. Joffre never did. But the method he used was the method that Joffre had put together, that he had designed, given the intellectual debates that he'd had with Foch years earlier.
maybe Pershing didn't like Foch because Foch was Pershing's boss for a short period of time.
That's probably had something to do with it.
Not long, but...
Yes, please.
The annual maneuvers that they would they activate their reserves for those annual maneuvers?
Yeah.
Call
Yeah.
them up?
Yeah. The whole issue of the reserves is a fascinating one to me, because if you know anything about the detail of the French army in terms of 3 years followed by 10 years and 6 years and 6 years, the previous chief of the general staff, Michel, is fired because he wants to form something called demi-brigades. Take a regiment of active troops and a regiment of reserve troops, and that would give them more units at the beginning of a war, and it would enable them to stretch their defense farther toward the English Channel. The French had huge debates about the role of the reserves, and they knew if they went to war, they would have to use those reserves. They just didn't want them in the front in the first wave of troops, because they thought they didn't have the expertise, the skills, the experience, and all of that. Now, knowing that, you wonder why were they so blind to what the Germans were doing? They had plenty of intelligence on what the Germans are doing, in the sense of the possibility of the Germans using their reserves in the front line. They get a copy of the German plan. They watch their map maneuvers. The Russians watch them also. They exchange information about the Russians and the French about what the Germans are doing, and they get all this information that, once we know the answer, we can say, well, gosh, it's pretty clear what the Germans are going to do. But when they connected the dots, the reserves are not going to be in the front line. That means the Germans will not have enough troops to extend all the way out. That means they'll come through, west of Mézières somewhere, and we can deliver that offensive into their underarm with no difficulty.
Well, they were half right.
They were half right. But I don't know how it's one of those things. I think intel officers, have dealt with a lot of them in my career. They are great at recognizing intelligence when it agrees with what they want to conclude. But when something doesn't, it's tough for them to accept it. And I think that's
a global trait.
Yeah, human trait.
Yeah.
That's what my wife tells me.
Except for the fact that Joffre was French, why is there so much English loathing of him?
I don't have a good answer for that, because Joffre is so welcoming of the BEF. He goes to war without the BEF. When Massimi comes to him during the crisis and says, "Can we go to war? Are we ready to go to war? Do we have a 70% chance of success?" Joffre says yes, and Massimi jumps up and claps his hands. He's so pleased to hear that they were going to war. But in that conversation and in the planning, Joffre knew what the French call Plan W. It's after General Wilson. They knew the British were coming. They thought it would be 6 divisions, not 4 divisions, with some cavalry. But they really thought that by the time the British got there, those key actions would have occurred. The British would be important in the sense of the overall balance, but the French thought they had to go to war without them. Once the French get into the fighting, the French are very critical of the British. I just mentioned Sir John French. He takes the BEF out of the line and says, we're going to go back around Paris and rest. It opens up this huge hole in French lines, and of course Joffre goes absolutely out of control when that happens. Sir John French does not like Joffre. Sir Douglas Haig does not like Joffre. I think a lot of that comes from they don't want to be controlled by Joffre. They do not want to be controlled by Joffre. And they will pick on any flaw that they can find in order to be critical of him. And I think a lot of the historians since then who read English language sources just copy those criticisms without seeing if there is any really other good explanation. Historians are always slaves to their materials. And if they only use one language in a war as complex as World War I, they don't have any idea what's happening in this war. You have to do something else in at least one other language to be able to have a better feel for what's going on. But the English historians have never liked Joffre. Of course, there's the famous book, The Donkeys, where they really don't like, the English historians don't like the British leaders either. So I don't know what the real answer to that is.
Okay, that's it. Other questions? Thank you very much.